Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Abraham Maslow, the architect of human potential. Together and apart, they trace the upward reaches of the human spirit, each mapping the journey toward wholeness through different landscapes of the psyche. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the heights of human becoming one, seeing the reconciliation of ancient opposites within the archetypal depths, the other discovering the hierarchical ascent towards self-actualization and transcendent experience. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Maslow as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the years following the great fracture between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, a silence descended upon Jung's life that was not empty but pregnant with possibility. The break had happened in 1913, a rupture that sent tremors through the early psychoanalytic community and left Jung alone to confront what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. In that solitude, wandering through the landscapes of his own inner life, Jung discovered territories that would reshape his understanding of the human psyche entirely. He encountered not merely repressed wishes or childhood traumas, but vast collective patterns, images that seemed to arise from a source deeper than personal memory. He met figures in his visions, wise old men, mysterious women, threatening shadows that spoke in the language of myth and symbol, a language older than civilization itself. Jung emerged from those years with a new cartography of the soul. Where Freud had mapped the terrain of neurosis and repression, Jung discovered what he called the collective unconscious, a shared inheritance of archetypal patterns that transcended individual experience. He developed the concept of individuation, a lifelong process of becoming whole through the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. This was not simply about achieving happiness or even mental health in the conventional sense, but about a deeper reconciliation, a marriage of opposites within. The psyche. The shadow must be acknowledged, the anima or animus encountered, the self, that central archetype representing wholeness, gradually approached through the work of a lifetime. By the time the 1920s and 30s arrived, Jung had established himself as a unique voice in psychology, one that spoke of alchemy and mythology, of mandalas and synchronicity, of the numinous encounters that occurred when the psyche touched something beyond the purely personal. His practice in Zurich drew seekers from around the world, people who sensed that their psychological distress was not merely pathology, but also a call toward transformation. Jung did not shy away from the religious dimensions of psychological experience. Indeed, he saw the religious instinct as fundamental to the psyche, not in terms of adherence to doctrine, but as an encounter with the sacred, with powers and patterns that exceeded the ego's grasp. Jung's psychology was, from its inception, a psychology of depth, It required descent before ascent, a willingness to confront the darkness within before any integration could occur. The journey of individuation was not a straight line upward, but a spiral, revisiting old wounds and complexes at deeper levels, gradually expanding consciousness to include more and more of what had been rejected, feared, or unknown. Jung trusted the symbolic productions of the psyche, dreams, fantasies, active imagination as guides in this process. He saw the psyche as self-regulating, as possessing an inherent wisdom that, if attended to properly, could guide the individual toward wholeness. This was the Jung who existed when, across the Atlantic in a very different America, a young man named Abraham Maslow was coming of age in the early decades of the 20th century. Abraham Harold Maslow was born in 1908 in Brooklyn, New York, the first of 7 children born to Jewish immigrant parents from Russia. His childhood was not easy. He later described himself as the little Jewish boy in the non-Jewish neighborhood, isolated, unhappy, spending much of his time in libraries and among books. His relationship with his mother was particularly troubled. He would later describe her as cruel and ignorant, a rejection so complete that he refused to attend her funeral. This early suffering created in him a hunger, not merely for understanding, but for something better, for a vision of human nature that was not limited to neurosis and conflict. Maslow's intellectual journey took him first through the behavioral psychology that dominated American universities in the 1930s and 40s. He studied under Harry Harlow, conducting research on primate behavior, and briefly embraced the rigorous, objective methodology of behaviorism. But even then, something in him resisted the reductionism implicit in viewing humans as mere stimulus-response mechanisms. His early work showed glimpses of broader interests he studied, dominance and sexuality in primates and humans, but always with an eye toward understanding the fuller complexity of motivation and behavior. The turning point in Maslow's thinking came through several influences. His studies with the Gestalt psychologist Max Wertheimer and the anthropologist Ruth Benedict opened new possibilities. In these individuals, Maslow encountered what he perceived as exceptionally healthy, self-actualizing people, and he began to study them informally, trying to understand what made them different. This was a radical shift in perspective for psychology. While Jung had explored the depths of the unconscious and the integration of the shadow, and while Freud had mapped the territory of neurosis, Maslow asked, what about the heights? What about the healthiest human beings? What could psychology learn by studying not just pathology, but exceptional functioning? This question led Maslow to develop what would become humanistic psychology, often called the third force in psychology, distinct from both psychoanalysis and behaviorism. His vision was optimistic, progressive, rooted in a belief that human nature possessed inherent tendencies toward growth and self-actualization. Unlike the European depth psychologists who had lived through the catastrophes of 2 world wars and had witnessed firsthand the shadow side of human nature, Maslow's American context gave him a different starting point. Post-war America, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, was a place of expanding possibilities, of economic growth and optimism about human potential. Maslow's psychology reflected this context, emphasizing not what was wrong with people, but what could go right. The relationship between Jung and Maslow was not one of direct collaboration or personal acquaintance in the way that Jung and Freud had known each other. There is no evidence that they ever met, no correspondence suggesting a deep mutual influence. Yet their relationship exists in a different register as a dialogue across intellectual traditions. as two different responses to the perennial human question of how one becomes more fully oneself. Both men were seekers. Both reached beyond the confines of academic psychology towards something larger. Both were willing to explore the spiritual dimensions of human experience at a time when such explorations were professionally risky. Maslow was certainly aware of Jung's work. In his writings, there are occasional references to Jung, sometimes appreciative, sometimes critical. Maslow's approach to the unconscious was markedly different from Jung's. Where Jung saw the unconscious as containing both creative and destructive potentials, as populated by autonomous complexes and archetypal forces that must be engaged with respect and caution, Maslow tended to view the deeper layers of the psyche more optimistically. For Maslow, the unconscious contained not just repressed wishes or archetypal patterns, but the suppressed potentials for growth, creativity, and self-actualization. His was, in many ways, a more benign vision of the psyche's depths. By the time Maslow published his landmark paper, A Theory of Human Motivation, in 1943, which introduced his hierarchy of needs, Jung was already in his late 60s, his major theoretical works behind him. Jung's psychological types had been published in 1921. His explorations of alchemy and the self were well underway, and he had developed a clinical practice and a body of thought that was both deeply rooted in European cultural history and uniquely his own. The two men were working in different worlds, both literally and conceptually, yet their paths would intersect in the territory of human transformation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs became one of the most influential ideas in 20th century psychology, depicted famously as a pyramid with basic physiological needs at the bottom, followed by safety needs, love, and belonging, esteem, and finally self-actualization at the peak. Later, he would add transcendence as a motivation beyond self-actualization, a recognition that the healthiest human beings moved beyond personal fulfillment towards something transpersonal. This hierarchy suggested a developmental logic. Lower needs must be substantially met before higher needs become prominent motivators. A person cannot focus on self-actualization if they are starving or in constant danger. The model was elegant, accessible, and profoundly influential in fields ranging from business management to education. Jung never proposed such a hierarchy. His psychology was not fundamentally about motivation in Maslow's sense, but about the dynamics of psychic energy and the unfolding of the individuation process. For Jung, the psyche operated according to principles of compensation and balance. If consciousness became too one-sided, the unconscious would compensate, producing dreams or symptoms that push toward a fuller equilibrium. The movement toward wholeness was not a matter of ascending a ladder of needs, but of integrating opposites, of allowing the self to emerge as the organizing center of the personality. Jung's patients were not climbing towards self-actualization. They were descending into their depths, confronting their shadows, and gradually discovering a center that transcended the ego. And yet, for all their differences, both men were mapping journeys of transformation. Both believed that human life had a direction, a telos, an inherent movement toward something more complete. For Maslow, this was self-actualization, the full realization of one's potentials and capacities. For Jung, it was individuation, the realization of the self through the integration of conscious and unconscious. Both concepts pointed toward wholeness, toward becoming more fully human, though they approached this destination from different angles and through different landscapes. Maslow's self-actualizing. People, the creative, autonomous, peak-experiencing individuals he studied were characterized by qualities such as spontaneity, acceptance of self and others, resistance to enculturation, philosophical sense of humor, and peak experiences. These peak experiences particularly interested Maslow. They were moments of intense joy, transcendence, connection with something larger than the individual self. In these moments, people reported feelings of unity, timelessness, self-transcendence, and a sense of the ultimate rightness of things. Maslow collected accounts of such experiences and recognized in them something essential about human potential. Jung would have recognized these peak experiences. His own psychology was deeply concerned with what he called numinous experiences, moments when the psyche encounters the sacred or the archetypal. Jung used the term numinous, borrowed from Rudolf Otto, to describe experiences of the holy other, the mysterium tremendum. For Jung, such experiences were not merely psychological, but also spiritual. They represented genuine encounters with transpersonal dimensions of reality. The great dreams, the visions, the synchronistic events that patients reported, these were not simply subjective experiences, but moments when the boundary between psyche and world became permeable, when the collective unconscious manifested in ways that could transform the individual. But Jung's framing was different from Maslow's. Where Maslow described peak experiences in largely positive, optimistic terms as moments of beauty, insight, and transcendence, Jung knew that numinous encounters could be terrifying, overwhelming, even destructive if the ego was not strong enough to contain them. The gods, the archetypes, were not simply benevolent forces promoting growth. They were autonomous powers that could possess, fragment, and overwhelm. The encounter with the self could be as much an ordeal as an achievement. Jung's psychology thus contained a darker, more ambivalent tone than Maslow's. It was less a celebration of human potential than a mapping of a dangerous journey through treacherous psychic terrain. The context in which each man worked shaped these differences profoundly. Jung's psychology was forged in the crucible of early 20th century Europe, with its world wars, its confrontation with barbarism erupting from the heart of civilized society, its revelation that the shadow side of human nature was far more powerful and destructive than the Enlightenment had imagined. Jung himself had German heritage and struggled during World War II with questions about collective psychology and the eruption of archetypal forces in mass movements. His psychology reflected a tragic sensibility, an awareness of how easily consciousness could be overwhelmed by unconscious contents, how fragile the ego's position was in relation to the vastness of the psyche. Maslow, by contrast, worked primarily in post-war America, a nation emerging victorious from World War II, enjoying unprecedented prosperity, and engaged in building institutions and exploring possibilities. His psychology reflected this context, forward-looking, optimistic, focused on growth and potential rather than on the shadow and the darkness. This was not a failing, but a different vantage point. Maslow wanted to create a psychology of health, not just pathology. And in doing so, he opened territory that had been largely neglected by the psychoanalytic tradition. He asked what the healthiest people were like and what psychology could learn from them, rather than focusing primarily on what went wrong in neurosis and psychosis. Yet we must be careful not to oversimplify. Maslow's later work, particularly as he aged and confronted his own mortality, became more complex and nuanced. He recognized that self-actualization was not a static achievement, but an ongoing process, that it involved not just positive experiences, but also struggle, existential anxiety, and what he called Jonah complex, the fear of one's own greatness. He acknowledged the pull towards safety and away from growth, the ways people sabotage their own potential, and in his final years, he moved beyond self-actualization toward transcendence, recognizing that the healthiest individuals were motivated by values and concerns that went beyond personal fulfillment. This movement toward transcendence in Maslow's work created interesting convergences with Jung's thought. Both men, in their different ways, recognized that the individual ego was not the final word in psychological development, that true maturity involved a kind of self-transcendence, a subordination of personal concerns to something larger. For Jung, this was symbolized by the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcended and included the ego. For Maslow, it was represented by what he called being values, truth, beauty, goodness, justice, and by the capacity for peak experiences that dissolve the boundaries of the separate self. The question of the unconscious remained a crucial point of difference. Jung's entire psychology was built on the reality and autonomy of the unconscious. He did not merely acknowledge its existence, he engaged with it as a living reality, as a source of both wisdom and danger. Through dreams, active imagination, and the analysis of symbolic material, Jung developed methods for bringing conscious and unconscious into dialogue. The unconscious was not something to be overcome or integrated away, but a permanent and essential aspect of the psyche that must be continuously engaged throughout life. Maslow's relationship with the unconscious was more ambivalent. He certainly acknowledged its existence and its importance, but his emphasis was different. He was interested in the unconscious primarily, as it contained suppressed potentials and creative impulses that could be released through growth and self-actualization. He did not develop therapeutic techniques for working with unconscious material in the way Jung did. His interest was more in conscious experience, in how people lived when they were functioning at their best, in the phenomenology of peak experiences and self-actualizing behavior. This difference reflects a fundamental divide in orientation. Jung was, despite his interest in transformation and growth, fundamentally a clinician working with suffering. His patients came to him in distress, caught in neurotic patterns, haunted by symptoms and complexes. The work of analysis was to understand what the psyche was trying to achieve through the symptom, to engage with the unconscious material that was pressing for recognition. Jung trusted that if this work was done properly, if the conscious and unconscious could be brought into dialogue, then healing and individuation would follow. But the path led through the darkness, through confrontation with the shadow, through difficult encounters with aspects of the self that had been rejected or denied. Maslow, while he did clinical work, was primarily a theorist and researcher interested in understanding the positive dimensions of human functioning. His approach was more observational than therapeutic. He studied people he admired, people who seemed to embody health and fulfillment, and tried to discern what made them different. This gave his work a different flavor, inspiring and aspirational rather than therapeutic and depth-oriented. Reading Maslow, one feels called upward. Reading Jung, one feels called inward and downward before any ascent becomes possible. Another crucial difference lies in their relationship to symbolism and mythology. For Jung, symbols were the primary language of the psyche. Dreams spoke in symbols. The unconscious communicated through symbolic images and narratives. Moreover, these symbols were not merely personal, but connected to universal mythological patterns. A patient, dreaming of descent into the underworld, was enacting the ancient myth of the night sea journey, the death and rebirth pattern found in countless cultures. Understanding the dream required understanding its mythological resonances, its connection to collective human experience. Maslow's interest in symbolism was more limited. While he recognized the importance of creativity and aesthetic experience, and while his concept of peak experiences included mystical and transcendent elements, he did not develop a symbolic psychology in Jung's sense. His language was more directly descriptive, his categories more straightforward. Self-actualization, peak experiences, being values. These were relatively transparent concepts compared to Jung's shadow, anima, self, and collective unconscious. Maslow wanted to make psychology scientific and accessible. Jung was willing to embrace ambiguity and depth even when it made his work harder to grasp. Yet both men struggled with the scientific establishment of their time. Jung was often dismissed by academic psychologists as mystical and unscientific, his interest in alchemy and mythology seen as evidence that he had strayed from legitimate psychological inquiry. Maslow, despite his efforts to create a scientific psychology of health, was also marginalized by the behaviorist mainstream that dominated American psychology through the middle of the 20th century. Both men were too interested in consciousness, subjectivity, and meaning to fit comfortably within the narrow confines of behaviorism. Both believed that a complete psychology must address questions of value, purpose, and transcendence, not just behavior and mechanism. This shared marginality helped create the humanistic psychology movement, which Maslow helped found, along with Carl Rogers and others in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Humanistic psychology positioned itself as a third force, an alternative to both psychoanalysis and behaviorism. It emphasized human potential, growth, creativity, and the subjective experience of the individual. Jung, though associated primarily with analytical psychology, became an important influence on humanistic and later transpersonal psychology. His concepts of individuation, the self, and the collective unconscious provided resources for thinking about human development beyond the medical model of pathology and cure. The 1960s brought Jung and Maslow's ideas into new proximity. The counterculture, with its interest in Eastern spirituality, psychedelics, and consciousness expansion, found resources in both thinkers. Jung's mandala symbolism, his interest in Eastern philosophy, his concepts of the shadow and the self, resonated with a generation questioning conventional values and seeking transformation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs and his concept of self-actualization provided a framework for understanding personal growth that aligned with the era's emphasis on human potential. It was during this period that transpersonal psychology emerged, explicitly attempting to integrate insights from Jung, Maslow, Eastern spiritual traditions, and the study of altered states of consciousness. Maslow became interested in transpersonal psychology toward the end of his life, recognizing that self-actualization was not the final stage of human development, but pointed beyond itself toward self-transcendence. This late movement in his thought brought him closer to Jung's perspective, acknowledging dimensions of human experience that exceeded the purely personal. But even here, differences remained. Transpersonal psychology, influenced by Maslow, tended toward an optimistic view of transcendent states as inherently healthy and growth-promoting. Jung's influence brought a more cautious note, a recognition that transpersonal experiences could be inflating, that encounters with archetypal material could overwhelm the ego, that spiritual development was not simply a matter of expansion, but also required grounding, integration, and a strong enough ego structure to contain the energies being activated. As we move deeper into the comparison between these two minds, we must hold both their commonalities and their differences. Both Jung and Maslow were seekers who refused to limit psychology to the study of pathology and mechanism. Both recognized that human beings are meaning-making creatures with capacities for transcendence, creativity, and transformation. Both challenged the reductionism of their respective traditions, Jung confronting Freud's sexual theory and the medical model, Maslow confronting behaviorism's refusal to engage with consciousness and subjectivity. Both believe that psychology must address the whole human being, including the spiritual dimensions of experience. Yet they approached the journey of human becoming from opposite directions. Maslow began with the heights, with the peak experiences and self-actualizing qualities of the healthiest individuals, and asked how we might understand and cultivate such health. Jung began with the depths, with the suffering that brings people into analysis, and discovered that the path through this suffering led to individuation, to wholeness. Maslow emphasized conscious striving and growth. Jung emphasized unconscious compensation and the integration of what consciousness had rejected. Maslow's vision was fundamentally optimistic about human nature. Jung's was more tragic and paradoxical, recognizing both creative and destructive potentials within the psyche. These differences are not merely theoretical, but reflect different ways of being in the world, different responses to the question of what it means to be human. As we continue our exploration, we will see how these different starting points lead to different understandings of motivation, growth, health, spirituality, and the ultimate goals of human life. We will consider what each perspective illuminates and what it may obscure, and how together they might offer a more complete map of the human journey toward wholeness. Let us now turn to examine in detail the specific concepts and frameworks each man developed, holding them side by side to see where they converge and where they part, listening for the dialogue between them across the distance of their different worlds. When we place Jung's concept of individuation beside Maslow's concept of self-actualization, we encounter two visions of human development that share a family resemblance yet diverge in fundamental ways. Both terms point toward a process of becoming more fully oneself, of realizing potentials that lie dormant or undeveloped in the average person. Yet the paths they describe, the obstacles they identify, and the destinations they envision are strikingly different. Individuation, for Jung, is the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. It is the realization in the individual of what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness and the regulating center of the psyche. Individuation is not about becoming perfect or achieving some ideal state, but about becoming complete, about integrating the various aspects of the personality, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, into a functional whole. It is a lifelong process, never fully completed, marked by confrontations with aspects of oneself that have been rejected or unknown. The journey of individuation typically begins with a crisis, a breakdown of the ego's previous adaptive strategies. The persona, the social mask we wear, proves insufficient. Symptoms emerge: depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, that signal that the psyche is demanding a new relationship between conscious and unconscious. In analysis, the individual begins to encounter the shadow, those aspects of the personality that the ego has deemed unacceptable and repressed. This confrontation is difficult, often painful, as it requires acknowledging parts of oneself that contradict the ego's preferred self-image. Beyond the shadow lies what Jung called the anima in men and the animus in women, the contrasexual archetype that mediates between ego and unconscious. The encounter with the anima or animus brings the individual face to face with the opposite gender within, with all the projections and complexities that entails. Through this encounter, consciousness expands, becoming capable of including modes of being that had been associated with the opposite sex. A man must integrate his feeling and relatedness. A woman must integrate her logos and assertiveness. These are not fixed gender essences, but archetypal patterns that each psyche must engage and individualize. As the process deepens, the individual begins to encounter what Jung called the self, symbolized often in dreams by mandalas, by divine figures, by images of totality and wholeness. The self is not the ego. It is a center and circumference that includes but transcends ego consciousness. The realization of the self does not mean the dissolution of the ego, but the ego's right relationship to a larger organizing principle. The individuated person is one whose ego serves the self rather than claiming to be the whole of the personality. This process cannot be forced or programmed. It unfolds according to its own logic, guided by the unconscious through dreams, symptoms, and the phenomena Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest a profound connection between inner and outer worlds. The analyst's role is not to direct the process, but to accompany the analysand, to help make sense of the symbolic material that emerges, to support the ego in its confrontations with overwhelming unconscious contents. Individuation is also inherently paradoxical. It involves becoming more uniquely oneself and simultaneously more universal, as the archetypal patterns one encounters are shared by all humanity. It requires strengthening the ego's capacity for consciousness, while also relativizing the ego's position in relation to the self. It demands both descent into the darkness and eventual ascent, both confrontation with evil within oneself and the discovery of a center of meaning and value. Jung insisted that individuation was not a path for everyone, that it required a certain level of consciousness and a willingness to confront the difficult aspects of oneself. It was, in his view, primarily relevant for the second half of life, after the ego had been adequately established through engagement with the outer world. Now, consider Maslow's self-actualization. In his seminal work, Motivation and Personality, Maslow described self-actualization as the full use and exploitation of talents, capacities, and potentialities. Self-actualizing people are characterized by more efficient perception of reality, acceptance of self and others, spontaneity, problem-centering rather than ego-centering, detachment and need for privacy, autonomy, continued freshness of appreciation, peak experiences, social interest, deep interpersonal relations, democratic character, structure, discrimination between means and ends, philosophical sense of humor, and creativity. This is a portrait not of a process but of an achievement, a way of being that some individuals attain. Maslow studied historical figures like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as living subjects, to discern the common qualities of highly functioning people. Self-actualization, in this framework, represents the fullest development of one's capacities and potentials. It is what human beings can become when lower needs for survival, safety, belonging, and esteem are adequately met. Unlike individuation, which emphasizes integration of opposites and confrontation with the shadow, self-actualization emphasizes growth, expansion, and the development of capacities. Maslow's self-actualizing people are not necessarily those who have done deep psychological work on their shadow material. They are people who are living fully, realizing their potentials, functioning at a high level. The emphasis is on health and positive functioning rather than on the resolution of inner conflict. Maslow later refined his theory, recognizing that self-actualization was not a static state, but an ongoing process, a matter of moments rather than a permanent achievement. He spoke of self-actualization as a process of making growth choices rather than fear choices, of listening to one's own inner nature rather than conforming to external expectations. This brought his concept closer to a developmental process, though still different from Jung's emphasis on the integration of unconscious material. The most crucial difference lies in the role of the unconscious and of conflict. For Jung, psychological development necessarily involves confronting inner conflict, integrating the shadow, wrestling with autonomous complexes and archetypal powers. The unconscious is not simply a repository of potential, but a realm of autonomous forces that must be engaged and integrated. For Maslow, while he acknowledged the unconscious, the emphasis was much more on conscious striving and actualization. The unconscious contained suppressed potentials, but the work of self-actualization was more about removing obstacles to growth, about creating conditions that allow the inherent tendency toward actualization to unfold. This reflects different views of human nature. Jung's view was essentially compensatory. The psyche seeks balance, and consciousness inevitably creates imbalance that the unconscious compensates for. The shadow accumulates as the ego identifies with one pole of opposites. Conflict is inherent in psychic life. Maslow's view was essentially actualistic. Human nature contains positive potentials that will emerge under the right conditions. While people can certainly become neurotic or dysfunctional, this is seen more as a result of unmet needs or suppression of the actualizing tendency than as an inherent feature of the psyche's structure. Interestingly, both men recognized that their concepts applied primarily to individuals who had achieved a certain level of ego development. Jung was explicit that individuation was primarily a task for the second half of life, after the ego had been established through adaptation to outer reality. Maslow's hierarchy suggested that self-actualization only became possible after lower needs were met, which implied a foundation of basic functioning. Neither was proposing that everyone was ready for or needed to pursue the highest levels of development. Yet there's an important convergence in their recognition of transcendence. Late in his life, Maslow added transcendence as a motivation beyond self-actualization. He recognized that the healthiest individuals were characterized not just by full functioning, but by self-transcendence, by concerns that went beyond personal fulfillment to encompass larger values and purposes. This movement in Maslow's thought brought him much closer to Jung's perspective, which had always emphasized that individuation involved transcending the ego, subordinating personal concerns to service of the self. Jung's concept of the self bears significant similarity to what Maslow called transcendence. Both point toward a center of organization that exceeds the personal ego. Both involve a kind of dying to the limited self and rebirth into a larger identity. Jung's self is not the ego, but a greater wholeness that includes conscious and unconscious. Maslow's self-transcendent individuals move beyond self-actualization toward identification with being values and transpersonal concerns. In both cases, the highest development involves paradoxically going beyond the separate self while simultaneously becoming more fully oneself. The concept of peak experiences provides another point of comparison. Maslow described peak experiences as moments of highest happiness and fulfillment, characterized by feelings of integration, wholeness, aliveness, self-validation, effortlessness, and transcendence of time and space. These experiences might occur in nature, in creative work, in lovemaking, in artistic or musical engagement, or in mystical contexts. They were, for Maslow, essential features of self-actualization, moments when the person experiences their fullest being. Jung's equivalent would be the humanistic experience, the encounter with archetypal reality. Jung was interested in those moments when the psyche encounters something that exceeds the ego's grasp, when one confronts what Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum, the wholly other that inspires both fascination and fear. These might occur in dreams, in visions, in synchronistic events, or in moments of profound psychological transformation. Like Maslow's peak experiences, numinous experiences convey a sense of reality and meaningfulness that exceeds ordinary life. The crucial difference is in tone and interpretation. Maslow's peak experiences are described primarily in positive terms: joy, fulfillment, unity, transcendence. They are experiences to be sought and valued as markers of health. Jung's numinous experiences include these positive dimensions, but also carry potential danger. The encounter with archetypal reality can be overwhelming, fragmenting, even psychosis-inducing if the ego is not strong enough to contain it. The gods are not only benevolent, they can demand and destroy. Numinous experiences must be approached with respect and proper preparation. They are not simply pleasant moments of transcendence, but encounters with autonomous powers. This reflects a deeper difference in how each man understood the relationship between consciousness and the transpersonal. Maslow, despite his later interest in transcendence, remained fundamentally humanistic. Peak experiences and transpersonal states were aspects of human experience, extensions of human potential. Jung's perspective was more genuinely transpersonal in the sense that the archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the numinous were not simply human experiences but encounters with something genuinely other, with dimensions of reality that transcended the human and individual. Consider how each man would approach a specific case. Imagine a successful middle-aged person who comes for help with a vague sense of meaninglessness, a feeling that despite outward success, something essential is missing. This is a common presentation in both Jungian analysis and humanistic therapy. Maslow might frame this as a case of someone whose lower needs are met. They have security, belonging, esteem, but who has not yet moved toward self-actualization or transcendence. The therapeutic work would focus on helping the person identify their unrealized potentials, their suppressed creativity or values. What talents have gone undeveloped? What peak experiences have they had that might point toward deeper fulfillment? What growth choices can they make instead of safety choices? The emphasis would be on forward movement, on actualizing potentials, on reaching toward fuller functioning. Jung would approach the same situation quite differently. The meaninglessness would be understood as the psyche's way of signaling that the current attitude is insufficient, that there are unconscious contents pressing for recognition. The work would begin with dreams and active imagination, seeking to understand what the unconscious is trying to communicate. Likely, there would be a shadow problem aspects of the personality that have been rejected in favor of the successful persona need to be integrated. Perhaps the person has identified too strongly with achievement and rationality, and the unconscious is compensating by producing a sense of emptiness that calls for engagement with other values, relationship, feeling, imagination, meaning beyond success. The Jungian work would involve dissent before ascent, a willingness to confront what has been neglected or rejected. The person would need to engage with their shadow, their unlived life, the roads not taken. This is not comfortable work. It might involve acknowledging envy, aggression, weakness, or desires that contradict the conscious self-image. It might require mourning for lost possibilities, for the price paid for success. Only through this confrontation and integration would genuine renewal become possible, guided not by conscious choice but by the self as it reveals itself through symbolic material. Both approaches aim at helping the person move beyond meaninglessness toward fuller life, but they take very different paths. Maslow's approach is more optimistic, forward-looking, focused on potential and growth. Jung's is more depth-oriented, requiring confrontation with difficult aspects of the psyche before transformation becomes possible. One emphasizes what can be, the other emphasizes what must be faced. Another key difference emerges in their understanding of motivation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs provided a framework for understanding human motivation as organized in levels, from basic physiological and safety needs through belonging and esteem to self-actualization and transcendence. This was an elegant scheme that helped explain why people focus on different concerns depending on their life circumstances. It suggested a developmental logic and made motivation comprehensible in relatively straightforward terms. Jung did not propose a theory of motivation in this sense. His psychology was organized around the concept of psychic energy, or libido, which he understood more broadly than Freud's sexual libido. Psychic energy flows toward whatever has value for the individual. When energy gets stuck, symptoms emerge. The psyche self-regulates through compensation, with the unconscious providing what consciousness lacks. Motivation, in this framework, is less about ascending a hierarchy and more about the dynamic interplay of conscious and unconscious, the psyche's inherent tendency toward wholeness and balance. For Jung, people are not primarily motivated by needs in Maslow's sense, but by the archetypes, by the psyche's inherent patterns and images. A person might be gripped by the archetype of the hero, driven toward conquest and achievement, or by the puer aeternus, the eternal youth seeking transcendence and avoiding commitment. These archetypal patterns shape motivation more fundamentally than any hierarchy of needs. The work of analysis is partly about becoming conscious of which archetypal patterns are constellation in one's life, and developing a more conscious relationship with them. This leads to different understandings of psychological health and pathology. For Maslow, health is characterized by movement towards self-actualization, efficient reality, perception, acceptance, spontaneity, autonomy, continued growth. Pathology represents arrested development, where lower needs remain unmet and higher potentials unrealized. Neurosis, in this view, is the stunting of growth, the suppression of the actualizing tendency. For Jung, health is characterized by a right relationship between conscious and unconscious, between ego and self. The healthy person is not necessarily high-functioning in Maslow's sense, but is someone whose ego remains flexible and open to unconscious communications, who can contain opposites without splitting, who maintains connection to the deeper layers of the psyche. Pathology represents one-sidedness, inflation or depletion of the ego, identification with an archetype, dissociation between conscious and unconscious. Neurosis and psychosis represent the psyche's attempts to restore balance through symptoms when consciousness has become too rigid or fragmented. These are profoundly different visions, yet both recognize that psychological health involves something more than mere adaptation or the absence of symptoms. Both insist that human beings have potential for development beyond conventional functioning, that there are heights or depths of experience that represent fuller realization of human nature. Both challenge the medical model that sees health simply as the absence of disease. The question of suffering provides another revealing point of comparison. In Maslow's framework, suffering is primarily an indicator of unmet needs or blocked growth. While he didn't deny the reality of suffering or the existence of what he called metapathologies, spiritual illnesses arising even in self-actualizing people, his emphasis was on removing obstacles to growth and creating conditions for actualization. Suffering was not seen as necessary to development, though he recognized that growth choices often involve anxiety and that self-actualization requires confronting the Jonah complex, the fear of one's own greatness. Jung's relationship to suffering was quite different. While he certainly aimed to relieve suffering, he also recognized it as often carrying meaning as the psyche's way of forcing a necessary transformation. The symptom is an expression of an unlived life, of rejected aspects of the personality demanding recognition. Suffering cannot simply be removed. It must be understood, engaged with, allowed to reveal what it is pointing toward. Some suffering is what Jung called the suffering of life itself, the pain inherent in consciousness, in the tension of opposites, in the price of individuation. This relates to their different views on integration and wholeness. For Maslow, wholeness comes through the realization and integration of positive potentials, the development of capacities that allow full functioning. For Jung, wholeness requires integrating not just potentials but actualities, including the shadow, the rejected and inferior aspects of the personality. You cannot become whole by developing only the positive. You must also acknowledge and integrate the negative, the destructive, the primitive aspects of the psyche. Jung's concept of the shadow is perhaps his most distinctive contribution, and it represents a dimension largely absent from Maslow's framework. The shadow includes all those aspects of the personality that the ego has rejected in forming its conscious identity. If the ego identifies with being good, the shadow contains the person's capacity for evil. If the ego identifies with rationality, the shadow contains irrationality and emotionality. The shadow is not merely personal but also collective, containing humanity's darker potentials for cruelty, destruction, and barbarism. Confronting the shadow is essential to individuation. One must acknowledge one's own capacity for what one condemns in others, must recognize that the potential for evil exists within oneself. This is humbling, often shameful work. It contradicts the ego's preferred self-image. Yet without this confrontation, the shadow remains projected onto others, and genuine wholeness is impossible. Moreover, the shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials that were rejected. The person identified with rationality may have shadow creativity and spontaneity. The person identified with goodness may have shadow strength and assertiveness. Maslow acknowledged the existence of aggression and negative qualities, but did not develop a comparable framework for understanding and working with them. His emphasis on self-actualization and peak experiences created a psychology that could sometimes seem to neglect the difficult, shadow aspects of human nature. Critics have noted that Maslow's psychology can appear naively optimistic, underestimating the depth of human destructiveness and the difficulty of psychological transformation. Yet, Maslow's later work showed increasing awareness of complexity. He recognized that self-actualization involves confronting anxiety, making difficult choices, facing existential concerns. He acknowledged what he called the Jonah complex, people's fear of their own potential, their tendency to sabotage growth. He noted that self-actualizing people were not perfect, but had their own problems and conflicts. Still, his framework did not provide the same resources for understanding and working with darkness that Jung's shadow concept offered. The spiritual dimension represents another area of both convergence and divergence. Both men took spirituality seriously as an essential aspect of human psychology, which set them apart from the mainstream of 20th century psychology. Both recognized that the healthiest people had what might be called spiritual concerns, connections to transcendent values, peak or numinous experiences, sense of meaning beyond the personal. Yet their frameworks for understanding spirituality differed significantly. Maslow's approach was essentially humanistic. He described peak experiences as natural human experiences, moments when people feel most fully themselves. He spoke of being values truth, beauty, goodness, justice, as the values of self-actualizing people. Spirituality, in this framework, is an aspect of human potential, the highest reaches of human functioning. It doesn't require belief in God or adherence to religious tradition. It's about the quality of experience and engagement with ultimate values. Jung's approach was more genuinely religious in the original sense of religio, a careful attention to the numinous. For Jung, the psyche had an inherently religious function, not meaning adherence to any particular faith, but an instinct for relationship with the sacred, with powers and meanings that transcend the ego. The religious attitude involved careful, respectful attention to unconscious contents, recognizing them as possessing a reality and autonomy that exceeded conscious control. Jung insisted that he was not making metaphysical claims about the existence of God, but was describing psychological facts, the God image in the psyche, the archetype of the self, the numinous experiences that people reported. Yet his framework allowed for a reality to religious experience that Maslow's more humanistic approach did not fully accommodate. For Jung, when people encountered the self in deep analysis, when they experienced synchronistic events or profound symbolic visions, something genuinely transpersonal was occurring. The psyche touched a reality that was not merely human. This difference reflects their different intellectual backgrounds. Jung was deeply rooted in European philosophy and theology, well-versed in Christian mysticism, Gnosticism, and Eastern religions. His father and several uncles were clergymen, and Jung grew up saturated in religious questions. He saw himself as addressing the spiritual crisis of modern humanity, the loss of symbolic life and connection to the numinous that came with the Enlightenment and scientific materialism. Maslow came from a different tradition. His background was Jewish. Though he was not religiously observant, his intellectual formation was in scientific psychology, and while he broadened psychology to include subjective experience and values, his orientation remained fundamentally humanistic and scientific. He wanted to study peak experiences empirically, to understand self-actualization through observation and research. This gave his work a different quality, more accessible, more positive, but perhaps less depth-oriented than Jung's immersion in religious symbolism and archetypal psychology. Their different approaches to therapeutic method also reveal fundamental differences. Jung developed specific techniques for engaging the unconscious dream analysis, active imagination, sand play, amplification of symbolic material. These methods aim to establish a dialogue between conscious and unconscious, to allow the unconscious to express itself so that its contents could be integrated. Jungian analysis was often long-term, involving years of work to move through the stages of confronting shadow, anima, animus, and approaching the self. Maslow was not primarily a therapist, and did not develop specific therapeutic techniques in the way Jung did. His work was more observational and theoretical. While humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers developed therapeutic approaches consistent with Maslow's framework, Maslow himself was more interested in studying healthy people than in treating pathology. This gives his work a different flavor, inspirational and theoretical rather than clinical and method-oriented. Yet both men influenced therapeutic practice profoundly. Jung's analytical psychology established a framework and methods that are still practiced today, with training institutes around the world certifying Jungian analysts. Maslow's ideas influenced humanistic and transpersonal therapies, shaped organizational psychology and education, and provided a framework for thinking about human potential that extended far beyond clinical practice. The question of science represents another point of difference. Jung had an ambivalent relationship with scientific psychology. He wanted his work to be taken seriously as science, conducted empirical research early in his career with word association tests, and always insisted he was describing psychological facts. Yet his work on alchemy, mythology, and synchronicity stretched beyond what mainstream science could accommodate. Jung was willing to explore the edges of rational understanding, to work with phenomena that didn't fit neatly into scientific frameworks. Maslow also wanted to be scientific, but in a broader sense than behaviorism allowed. He argued for what he called a humanistic science, one that could study consciousness, values, and subjective experience without reducing them to observable behavior. He conducted research, gathered data on self-actualizing people, and tried to develop testable propositions. Yet, like Jung, he was willing to explore territory that made conventional scientists uncomfortable: peak experiences, being values, transcendence. Both men paid a price for their expansive vision. Jung was often dismissed as mystical and unscientific by academic psychology. Maslow, despite his efforts to remain within scientific psychology, was sometimes seen as too subjective and speculative. Yet both believed that psychology must expand to accommodate the full range of human experience, that a narrow scientism would miss the most important aspects of human psychology. The cultural contexts in which each man worked shaped their thought in profound ways. Jung's Switzerland, his European heritage, his immersion in the crisis of Western civilization following 2 world wars, this gave his psychology a certain gravitas, a sense of working with forces larger than the individual. His patients included people grappling with existential despair, spiritual crisis, the breakdown of meaning in modern life. His psychology reflected this context, offering resources for understanding collective crises and the archetypal forces operating in history. Maslow's America, particularly post-war America, with its optimism and expansion, its faith in progress and human potential, this context shaped his psychology differently. His work reflected American pragmatism, emphasis on the individual, belief in improvement and growth. Where Jung's psychology sometimes feels like descent into ancient depths, Maslow's feels like ascent toward new possibilities. Both are valid responses to the human situation, reflecting different cultural moments and needs. As transpersonal psychology developed in the 1960s and 70s, it attempted to integrate insights from both Jung and Maslow, along with Eastern spiritual traditions and research on altered states of consciousness. Ken Wilber, Stanislav Grof, Francis Vaughan, Roger Walsh, and others built frameworks that drew on Jung's archetypal psychology and Maslow's work on transcendence and peak experiences. This integration recognized that both thinkers had important pieces of the puzzle, that a complete psychology of human potential needed both the depth dimension Jung provided and the growth dimension Maslow emphasized. Yet tensions remained. The Jungian influence in transpersonal psychology brought depth, shadow work, respect for the autonomous unconscious, and sophisticated understanding of symbolism. The Maslowian influence brought optimism, emphasis on health and growth, and a more accessible framework for understanding development. Some transpersonal psychologists leaned more toward one pole or the other, creating different flavors of transpersonal thought. Consider their different views on the relationship between individual and collective. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious posited a shared inheritance of archetypal patterns, a level of psyche that transcended the personal and connected each individual to universal human patterns. Individuation, paradoxically, made one more individual and more universal simultaneously, as the archetypal patterns one encountered were both uniquely expressed in one's own psyche and shared by all humanity. Maslow's framework was more focused on the individual. While he certainly recognized social and cultural influences, his hierarchy of needs and concept of self-actualization were essentially individual achievement models. Self-actualization happened in persons, not in collectives. While self-actualizing people might have social concerns and work for larger values, the fundamental unit of analysis was the individual realizing their unique potentials. This reflects a deeper philosophical difference. Jung's psychology was built on the reality of the collective unconscious, of transpersonal patterns that shaped individual psychology from below or beyond. Maslow's was built on the actualizing tendency within individuals, on the inherent tendency of organisms to develop their capacities. Jung looked to what was shared and universal. Maslow looked to what was individual and unique, though both recognized both dimensions. Their views on psychological development across the lifespan also differed. Jung explicitly saw individuation as primarily a task for the second half of life. The first half was for ego development, for establishing oneself in the world, for achievement and adaptation. Only after this foundation was laid could one turn inward toward the deeper work of integrating the shadow, encountering the anima or animus, and approaching the self. Jung saw a natural shift in life's priorities around midlife, when outer achievements no longer satisfied and inner questions became more pressing. Maslow's hierarchy suggested development could occur throughout life, though he recognized that basic needs must be met before higher needs became motivating. He studied self-actualizing people of various ages, though many of his exemplars were older individuals who had achieved much in their lives. His later addition of transcendence as a motivation beyond self-actualization suggested stages of development that might particularly characterize later life, though he didn't make this as explicit as Jung's distinction between life's halves. Both frameworks recognized that psychological development is not finished with physical maturity, that human beings continue to develop psychologically throughout life. This was an important recognition, challenging the assumption that adulthood was a static state. Yet they described this development differently. Jung as a process of integration and encounter with the unconscious, Maslow as progressive actualization of potentials and eventual transcendence of personal concerns. The question of personality types provides another angle of comparison. Jung developed a sophisticated typology based on attitudes of introversion and extroversion and 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. This typology was not merely descriptive, but reflected the psyche's structure and the compensatory relationship between conscious and unconscious. Each person had a superior function that consciousness preferred, and an inferior function that remained less developed and more unconscious. The work of individuation involved developing the less preferred functions, becoming more whole and flexible. Maslow did not develop a comparable typology. His interest was more in levels of development, the progression from need-motivated behavior to growth-motivated behavior, from deficiency needs to being needs. He did recognize individual differences in how people actualized, noting that self-actualization took different forms in different people. But he didn't develop a systematic framework for understanding personality differences in the way Jung did. Jung's typology has been influential, inspiring instruments like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, and continuing to shape how people think about personality differences. It reflects his general tendency toward systematic thinking, toward mapping the psyche's structure with precision and detail. Maslow's approach was looser, more focused on general principles of motivation and development than on detailed categorization of types. Another significant difference lies in their views on pathology and its relationship to growth. For Jung, neurosis was not simply pathology, but often an attempt by the psyche to force necessary development. A person stuck in an inadequate attitude develops symptoms that make the old way untenable, forcing a new adaptation. In this sense, neurosis can be understood as the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. The symptom points toward what needs to be integrated, what has been neglected or rejected. This view gives suffering and pathology a different significance than they have in most medical models. The symptom is not simply something to be removed, but something to be understood, a message from the unconscious about what needs to change. Treatment aims not at symptom removal, but at understanding what the symptom is trying to achieve, what the psyche is attempting through it. Often, when the message is understood and the necessary development occurs, the symptom naturally resolves. Maslow's view of pathology was simpler. Neurosis represented blocked growth, unmet needs, or what he called metapathologies in self-actualizing people, diseases of the soul that arose from lack of ultimate values or meaning. Treatment involved removing obstacles to growth, helping people meet their needs, supporting their actualizing tendency. While he recognized that growth could involve crisis and difficulty, his emphasis was on forward movement rather than on understanding symptoms as meaningful communications from the unconscious. These different views would lead to different therapeutic responses to the same presenting problem. Consider someone with depression. A Jungian analyst would explore what the depression might be compensating for, what unconscious content it might contain. Perhaps the person has been too inflated, too identified with success, and the depression brings necessary humility and dissent. Perhaps it contains rejected feeling or signals that meaning has been lost. The work would involve exploring dreams and symbolic material to understand what the psyche is trying to achieve through the depression. A Maslow-influenced therapist might explore which needs are unmet, what potentials are being suppressed, what growth choices are not being made. The depression might be understood as arising from inauthentic living, from suppressing one's true self to meet others' expectations. The therapeutic work would focus on helping the person identify and pursue their authentic desires and potentials, removing internal and external obstacles to self-actualization. Both approaches have value, and both might help. They simply work at different levels and with different assumptions about what depression is and what it means. Jung's approach goes deeper into symbolic meaning and unconscious dynamics. Maslow's is more focused on conscious life choices and the realization of potential. Neither is complete without the other, though each represents a coherent approach to psychological healing. The role of consciousness itself was understood differently by each man. For Jung, consciousness was a relatively recent evolutionary development, always precariously established against the vast unconscious. The ego was like an island in the ocean of the unconscious, and it could easily be overwhelmed by unconscious contents if not properly grounded and related to the self. Consciousness had to be carefully tended, strengthened, and expanded, but always in relationship with the unconscious. Too much consciousness without compensatory relationship to the unconscious led to inflation and splitting. Too little consciousness left one at the mercy of unconscious forces. Maslow saw consciousness somewhat differently. His emphasis was on expanding awareness, on becoming more conscious of one's feelings, needs, and potentials. Self-actualizing people were characterized by more efficient and accurate perception of reality, greater self-awareness, ability to transcend ego concerns. Consciousness was to be expanded and trusted. The unconscious, while acknowledged, was not given the same central role it played in Jung's framework. This relates to their different views on the ego. Jung saw the ego as the center of consciousness, but not the center of the personality as a whole that was the self. The ego must be strong enough to engage with unconscious contents without being overwhelmed, yet flexible enough to subordinate itself to the self's guidance. An inflated ego, identifying itself with the self, or with an archetype, was a source of pathology. A depleted ego, unable to maintain boundaries with the unconscious, led to disintegration. Maslow's view was more about the ego transcending itself through self-actualization and peak experiences. The rigid, defensive ego needed to become more fluid, more open, less defended. Self-actualizing people were characterized by ego transcendence, moving beyond narrow self-concern to identification with larger values and concerns. This was closer to the spiritual tradition's emphasis on transcending ego than to Jung's more complex view of ego-self relationship. Their views on evil and the shadow side of human nature reveal perhaps the starkest difference between them. Jung took evil seriously as a reality in the psyche and in the world. The shadow contained genuine destructive potentials, and consciousness of these potentials was essential to psychological wholeness. Moreover, Jung grappled with the problem of evil theologically, questioning traditional Christian views of evil as merely the absence of good. His late work on the psychology of religion included controversial speculations about evil as requiring integration even into the image of God. Maslow's psychology had less room for the reality of evil. While he acknowledged aggression and destructive behavior, he tended to see these as arising from unmet needs or frustrated growth rather than as fundamental aspects of human nature. His emphasis on the positive potentials in human nature sometimes seemed to minimize the darker realities that Jung insisted must be confronted. Critics have noted this as a limitation of humanistic psychology more broadly, a tendency toward naive optimism about human nature that doesn't adequately account for humanity's capacity for evil. This difference reflected their different life experiences and cultural contexts. Jung witnessed the rise of Nazism, grappled with questions about his own cultural heritage, and struggled to understand how civilized people could commit such atrocities. The reality of evil was forced upon his consciousness in ways that demanded psychological explanation. Maslow, while certainly aware of human destructiveness, worked in a context where optimism about human potential felt more viable. Post-war American prosperity and expansion created conditions where focusing on positive potential made sense in a way it might not have in war-torn Europe. Yet we must be careful not to caricature either position. Jung was not pessimistic about human nature. His entire project of individuation was predicated on the possibility of psychological transformation and wholeness. He simply insisted that transformation required confronting darkness, not denying it. And Maslow was not naively optimistic. His later work showed increasing awareness of the difficulties and complexities of self-actualization, the ways people sabotage their own growth, the persistence of metapathologies even in highly developed people. The integration of masculine and feminine principles provides another revealing comparison. Jung's concepts of anima and animus represented archetypal images of the opposite gender within each person's psyche. The anima in men was the soul image, the mediator between ego and unconscious, carrying qualities of feeling, relationship, and connection to the unconscious. The animus in women was the image of logos, of assertion and discrimination. Integration of the contrasexual archetype was essential to individuation, allowing each person to access modes of being typically associated with the opposite gender. This framework has been criticized for reifying gender stereotypes, and contemporary Jungian thought has worked to refine these concepts beyond the binary gender assumptions of Jung's time. Yet the core insight remains valuable that each person contains potentials associated with both masculine and feminine modes of being, and that wholeness requires integrating both. Maslow did not develop a comparable framework for thinking about masculine and feminine integration. His concept of self-actualization was not explicitly gendered, though his list of self-actualizing exemplars included both men and women. He recognized that self-actualization took different forms in different people, but didn't focus specifically on gender integration as a developmental task. His framework was in some ways more egalitarian, not assigning different psychological tasks or structures to men and women. Both approaches have merits and limitations. Jung's framework, for all its problems with gender essentialism, recognized that integration of opposites, including masculine and feminine, was central to psychological wholeness. Maslow's less gendered approach avoided some stereotyping, but perhaps missed something about the psychological significance of gender and the need to integrate diverse modes of being. The question of authenticity and the true self represents an area of convergence. Both men believed that psychological health involved being true to one's own nature rather than conforming to external expectations. Jung's individuation was about becoming who you uniquely are, not who society expects you to be. The persona, the social mask, must be recognized as a mask, not confused with the true self. Similarly, Maslow emphasized that self-actualization required listening to one's own inner nature, making growth choices rather than fear choices, resisting pressures toward conformity. Both men thus challenged the social conformity that characterized much of 20th century life. Jung's patients often came to analysis because adaptation to social expectations had failed, leaving them depressed or anxious. The therapeutic work involved discovering a more authentic relationship to oneself, one that might require standing apart from collective values and expectations. Maslow's critique of average adjustment, his insistence that psychology should study the healthiest rather than the most typical people, similarly challenged conformity to mediocrity. This emphasis on authenticity and individuality made both men attractive to the counterculture of the 1960s and to subsequent movements emphasizing personal growth and self-discovery. Their work provided resources for questioning conventional values and seeking more authentic ways of being. Yet neither was simply advocating narcissistic self-indulgence. Jung's individuation involved responsibility to the self and to one's unique vocation. Maslow's self-actualizing people were characterized by social interest and concern for larger values, not mere selfishness. The role of relationship and community differed between their frameworks. Jung's analytical psychology focused primarily on the individual's relationship with their own psyche, though relationship with the analyst was crucial to the process. Individuation was ultimately a solitary journey, though it occurred in relationship. Jung recognized the importance of projection in relationships we see in others, what is unconscious in ourselves, and the work of withdrawing projections to relate more consciously. But his primary focus was on the individual's inner work. Maslow's hierarchy included love and belonging as fundamental needs that must be met before self-actualization becomes possible. Yet his concept of self-actualization, while including capacity for deep relationships, was essentially individualistic. Self-actualizing people might have profound relationships, but these arose from their own wholeness rather than from dependency or need. Maslow distinguished between deficiency love, arising from unmet needs, and being love, the love of whole people who love for the sheer pleasure of loving. Neither framework gives community the central role it has. In some other psychological or spiritual traditions, both men were focused primarily on individual development, though both recognize that truly developed individuals naturally contribute to collective well-being. This individualistic emphasis has been both a strength and a limitation of their work. A strength in honoring individual uniqueness in the interior journey, a limitation in perhaps underemphasizing the communal and relational dimensions of human existence. Their views on creativity offer another point of comparison. Jung saw creativity as arising from the unconscious, from an encounter with archetypal material that the artist or creative person brought into form. The creative person was one who could access the collective unconscious and give expression to its contents in ways that spoke to others. This required a certain permeability between conscious and unconscious, a capacity to allow unconscious material to emerge without being overwhelmed by it. Maslow studied creativity in self-actualizing people and distinguished between special talent creativity, which required gifts in particular domains, and self-actualizing creativity, a more general freshness of perception and spontaneity available to everyone. His emphasis was more on creativity as a quality of being than as the production of great works, though he certainly appreciated exceptional creative achievement. Self-actualizing creativity involved seeing freshly, being spontaneous, being less bound by convention and expectation. Both men saw creativity as essential to human fulfillment, not as a luxury but as a fundamental human capacity and need. Both believed that creative living required breaking free from convention and accessing deeper sources of inspiration. Jung's emphasis was more on the archetypal sources of creativity and the dangers, as well as gifts of the creative process. Maslow's was more on creativity as an expression of healthy functioning. The question of ultimate meaning and purpose in human life represents a final area of comparison. Jung's psychology was teleological, seeing the psyche as oriented toward a goal, the realization of the self, the achievement of wholeness. This gave life an inherent meaning and direction, though the specific content of that meaning was unique to each individual. Individuation was the meaning of life in Jung's view, the purpose for which we exist. This was not meaning imposed from outside, but meaning arising from the psyche's own nature and trajectory. Maslow also saw human life as having direction towards self-actualization and transcendence. The hierarchy of needs suggested that human beings naturally move toward higher values and concerns when lower needs are met. Self-actualizing people were characterized by a philosophical sense of life's meaningfulness, by connection to being values that transcended mere survival or pleasure. Yet Maslow's framework was more humanistic, locating meaning in human potential and values rather than in transpersonal archetypes or the self. Both men thus offered antidotes to the meaninglessness and despair that characterized much of 20th century existence. Against existential absurdism and nihilism, they proposed that human life has inherent meaning and direction, that the journey of becoming more fully human is itself meaningful. This was neither a religious meaning imposed by external authority, nor a constructed meaning created arbitrarily, but meaning discovered through the process of psychological development itself. As we step back from these detailed comparisons, we can see that Jung and Maslow were engaged in parallel but distinct projects. Both sought to expand psychology beyond pathology to include the heights and depths of human possibility. Both challenged reductionism and materialism, insisting that consciousness, values, meaning, and transcendence were legitimate subjects for psychological investigation. Both believed that human beings had capacities for development beyond mere adaptation or symptom-free functioning. Yet they approached this shared territory from different directions and with different emphases. Jung descended into the depths, insisting that the path to wholeness required confronting the shadow, engaging the unconscious, integrating opposites. His psychology was depth-oriented, archetypal, symbolic, aware of both creative and destructive potentials in the psyche. Maslow ascended toward the heights, studying the healthiest people and asking what psychology could learn from exceptional functioning. His psychology was growth-oriented, humanistic, optimistic about human nature, focused on potential and actualization. These different emphases reflect different sensibilities, different cultural contexts, different life experiences. Jung's European context his experience of war and collective catastrophe, his deep immersion in religious and mythological traditions, shaped a psychology that took darkness seriously and sought wholeness through integration. Maslow's American context, his experience of post-war optimism and expansion, his scientific training and humanistic values, shaped a psychology that celebrated human potential and sought to understand and cultivate health. The dialogue between these perspectives enriches both. Jung's depth psychology provides resources for working with shadow, with suffering, with the numinous and archetypal dimensions of experience that Maslow's framework doesn't fully address. Maslow's emphasis on growth, potential, and positive functioning balances Jung's sometimes heavy focus on shadow and pathology, reminding us that psychology should also study and cultivate health. Together, they offer a more complete map of the human journey toward wholeness than either provides alone. Contemporary psychology has learned from both traditions. Positive psychology has built on Maslow's foundation, studying well-being, flourishing, and optimal functioning. Depth psychology continues to draw on Jung's insights about the unconscious, archetypes, and symbolic processes. Transpersonal psychology attempts to integrate both perspectives, recognizing that a complete psychology of human transformation needs both the depth dimension and the growth dimension, both shadow work and actualization, both descent and ascent. As this night deepens and we prepare to move into the final meditation on what these two minds reveal about the human condition, let yourself rest with the complementarity of their visions. Both Jung and Maslow were cartographers of consciousness, each mapping different regions of the vast territory of human possibility. Their charts, laid side by side, show us more of the landscape than either could reveal alone. In the dialogue between them, spoken across the distance of their different worlds, we hear a fuller truth about what it means to become human. Now we arrive at the threshold where comparison gives way to contemplation, where the specific differences between Jung and Maslow dissolve into a larger meditation on the nature of the human journey they both sought to illuminate. Here, in this space between waking analysis and sleeping wisdom, we can ask what their dialogue reveals about the deepest questions of human existence. What does it mean to become more fully oneself? How does the soul grow toward wholeness? What is the relationship between the heights of human potential and the depths of the unconscious? Let these questions carry you gently toward sleep as we explore the eternal mysteries their work continues to illuminate. Consider first the profound truth that both men recognized. Human life is not a static state, but a journey, a process of becoming. This seems simple, yet it revolutionizes our understanding of what it means to be human. We are not fixed entities, but dynamic processes, always in motion between what we have been and what we might become. Jung called this process individuation. Maslow called it self-actualization. But beneath the different names lies the same recognition that human beings are oriented towards something more complete, that we contain within us a direction, a pull toward wholeness. This directionality is perhaps the most mysterious and profound fact about human consciousness. Why should we not be content with mere survival, with meeting our basic needs and reproducing? Why does something in us reach beyond adaptation toward meaning, toward growth, toward transcendence? Neither Jung nor Maslow fully answered this question, though both honored it with their entire life's work. Perhaps the question cannot be fully answered, but only lived, as each of us follows the unique path of our own becoming. Jung's answer, if we can call it that, pointed toward the self, that organizing principle at the center of the psyche that exceeds and includes the ego, that draws us toward wholeness through the integration of opposites. The self is both within and beyond, both personal and transpersonal, both psychological and spiritual. It manifests in dreams as images of wholeness mandalas, divine figures, symbols of totality. It guides the process of individuation through the symbolic productions of the unconscious. Yet it remains ultimately mysterious, never fully graspable by consciousness, always exceeding our attempts to define or contain it. Maslow's answer pointed toward the actualizing tendency, an inherent organismic capacity to develop one's potentials, to move toward fuller functioning. This tendency is built into life itself, manifesting in the seed that grows into the tree, the child that develops into the adult, the person who moves from meeting basic needs toward self-actualization and transcendence. Like Jung's self, Maslow's actualizing tendency is mysterious. Why should organisms develop rather than merely persisting? Why should complexity and consciousness emerge from simpler forms? These are questions at the boundary of psychology and philosophy, where science meets wonder. Both perspectives point towards something like what Aristotle called entelechy, the realization of form, the movement from potential to actuality. Both suggest that human nature contains within itself a blueprint or direction, not deterministic, but probabilistic, not fixed, but directional. We are made to become, and what we are to become is somehow already present within us as potential, waiting to unfold under the right conditions. Yet the conditions required for this unfolding are different in each framework. For Jung, the essential condition is consciousness, the willingness to attend to the unconscious, to engage with dreams and symbolic material, to confront the shadow and the other rejected aspects of the self. Without consciousness, without the often difficult work of making the unconscious conscious, the individuation process remains potential rather than actual. The psyche may push toward wholeness through symptoms and crises, but genuine transformation requires the ego's conscious participation. For Maslow, the essential conditions are more environmental and interpersonal. Basic needs must be met. The person requires safety, love, esteem. In an environment that provides these conditions, the actualizing tendency naturally emerges. The work is less about making the unconscious conscious and more about removing obstacles to growth, about creating conditions that allow the inherent tendency toward actualization to manifest. When obstacles are removed and needs are met, people naturally move toward health. These different emphases reflect different understandings of what blocks development. Jung saw the fundamental obstacle as unconsciousness, the ego's identification with a limited part of the personality, the rejection of shadow material, the inflation or depletion that comes from wrong relationship between ego and unconscious. The solution is increasing consciousness, bringing light to what has been dark, integrating what has been split off. Maslow saw obstacles more in terms of environmental deficits and fear. Unmet needs keep people stuck at lower levels of motivation. Fear of growth, fear of one's own potential, anxiety about change, these internal obstacles arise from past experience and keep people from actualizing. The solution is creating safety, meeting needs, encouraging growth choices over fear choices. Both are right, of course. Development is blocked by both internal unconsciousness and external conditions. by both intrapsychic dynamics and environmental factors. A complete psychology of human growth must attend to both dimensions. Yet the different emphases are important, as they lead to different interventions and different understandings of suffering. Consider suffering itself, that universal human experience that brings so many people to seek psychological help. Jung understood suffering as often necessary as the psyche's way of forcing consciousness to attend to what has been neglected. The symptom is a call from the soul, demanding that life be lived differently. Suffering, thus, has meaning, even if that meaning is only discovered retrospectively after the crisis has forced transformation. This view does not romanticize suffering. Jung knew its pain intimately, but it refuses to see suffering as merely negative, as only something to be eliminated. Maslow's view was more straightforward. Suffering indicates unmet needs or blocked growth. While he recognized that growth could be anxiety-provoking and that self-actualization required facing fears, his emphasis was on alleviating suffering by meeting needs and removing obstacles. Suffering was not given the same potentially positive significance it had in Jung's framework. It was simply what happened when the actualizing tendency was frustrated. These different views have implications for how we live with suffering when it comes. A Jungian perspective invites us to ask what the suffering might mean, what it might be pointing toward, what the psyche might be trying to achieve through it. This can be profoundly helpful when suffering cannot simply be eliminated, when we must live with loss, limitation, or existential pain. Finding meaning in suffering does not remove the pain, but can transform our relationship to it, can allow it to become part of the journey toward wholeness rather than merely a misfortune to be endured. A Maslowian perspective invites us to ask what needs are unmet, what growth is being blocked, what choices we might make to move toward greater fulfillment. This can be profoundly helpful when suffering arises from deprivation or blocked potential, when we have power to change our circumstances or make different choices. It emphasizes agency and possibility rather than acceptance and meaning. Both perspectives are needed. Some suffering requires acceptance and the search for meaning. Some requires action and change. The wisdom is knowing which approach is called for in any given situation. And perhaps the deepest wisdom recognizes that most situations require both acceptance and action, both finding meaning and making changes, both descent into darkness and ascent toward light. The tension between descent and ascent, between depth and height, runs through the entire dialogue between Jung and Maslow. Jung's path leads downward first, into the depths of the unconscious, into confrontation with shadow and complexes, into the underworld of rejected aspects of self. Only after this descent does ascent become possible, as the integrated contents allow consciousness to expand and the self to emerge as organizing center. The alchemical image Jung loved, solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine, captures this rhythm of descent and reconstruction. Maslow's path leads upward, ascending through the hierarchy of needs towards self-actualization and transcendence. The movement is from deficiency to growth, from need to being, from lower to higher. While he recognized that growth involved anxiety and struggle, his primary metaphor was ascending, reaching toward the heights of human potential. Yet, perhaps, these are not opposite movements, but complementary phases of a single journey. Descent and ascent, depth and height, are not contradictory but dialectical. To reach the heights, one must also plumb the depths. To actualize potential, one must integrate the shadow. The peak experiences Maslow described might require the depth work Jung emphasized, and the wholeness Jung sought might manifest as the full functioning Maslow celebrated. This integration is suggested by the mandala, that symbol of wholeness Jung found in cultures around the world and in his patient's dreams. The mandala is both centered and expansive, both descended to a point and radiating outward. It holds the tension of opposites in perfect balance. It suggests that wholeness is not either depth or height, but their integration, their mutual necessity. Consider peak experiences and numinous encounters, those moments of transcendence both men recognized as essential to full human life. Maslow described them as moments of being in the zone, experiences of perfection, of everything being exactly as it should be. He collected accounts from many sources: athletes, artists, lovers, people in nature, people in creative flow. These experiences were characterized by feelings of unity, of self-transcendence, of timelessness, of ultimate rightness. Jung's numinous experiences shared many of these qualities, but included a dimension of otherness, of encounter with powers and meanings beyond the personal. When someone dreamed of a divine figure, experienced a profound synchronicity, or felt themselves in the presence of the sacred, something was happening that exceeded mere personal psychology. The numinous was not reducible to subjective experience. It pointed toward a reality that was genuinely transpersonal, genuinely other. Is there a real difference here? Or are they describing the same phenomena in different languages? Perhaps both. The experiences Maslow described often did have a quality of encountering something beyond the personal self, even if he framed them in humanistic language. And the numinous experiences Jung described were certainly subjective experiences, even if they pointed toward transpersonal realities. The difference may be less in the experiences themselves and more in how each man chose to interpret and contextualize them. Maslow stayed within a humanistic frame, understanding peak experiences as natural human experiences, moments when the person is most fully themselves. Jung was willing to make larger claims, to suggest that the psyche touched realities beyond itself in numinous moments. Neither position can be definitively proven. They represent different philosophical commitments about the nature of reality and the psyche's relationship to it. Yet for those who experience them, these moments often carry a conviction of reality that exceeds the merely subjective. Something is revealed, something is encountered that changes one's understanding of existence itself. Whether we call this a peak experience or a numinous encounter, whether we frame it humanistically or transpersonally, the experience itself remains moments when the veil thins, when the ordinary becomes transparent to something more, when we touch a dimension of existence that we usually miss in our everyday preoccupations. Both Jung and Maslow believed these experiences were essential to full human life, not merely pleasant luxuries, but necessities of the soul. Without contact with transcendence, however we name it, human life becomes flat, meaningless, reduced to mere survival and acquisition. We need these encounters with the more than ordinary to remember who we are and what life can be. In this, both men stood against the reductionism and materialism of modern culture, insisting that human beings have capacities and needs that exceed the material and rational. This brings us to the question of the sacred, the holy, the numinous, that dimension of experience that both men recognized but framed differently. For Jung, the sacred was a psychological reality that could not be reduced to projection or sublimation. When people encountered the numinous, whether in religious contexts or in depth analysis, something genuinely transpersonal was happening. The archetypes were not merely psychological constructs, but had a reality that exceeded individual psychology. The God image in the psyche pointed toward a reality beyond the psyche, though Jung, as psychologist, could only speak of the image, not the reality itself. Maslow's approach was more cautious. He wanted to naturalize spiritual experience, to show that peak experiences were natural human capacities, not dependent on belief in supernatural realities. Yet his framework opened psychology to the study of transcendent experience in ways that had been largely closed. He showed that secular people, non-religious people, could have experiences of transcendence, unity, and ultimate meaning. He democratized spirituality, making it available beyond the boundaries of traditional religion. Both approaches have value. Jung's willingness to engage the sacred on its own terms, to take religious experience seriously as encounter with genuine otherness, honors the depth of spiritual experience. Maslow's naturalization of spiritual experience makes it accessible to those who cannot accept traditional religious frameworks, showing that transcendent experience is a human capacity, not a theological doctrine. Together, they suggest that the sacred is both within and beyond, both psychological and transpersonal, both natural and transcendent. The psyche has a religious instinct, a capacity for encounter with the numinous that is part of our nature as human beings. Yet this capacity connects us with realities that exceed the purely personal, that touch dimensions of existence larger than individual psychology. The sacred is not reducible to psychology, yet it requires psychological understanding if we are to relate to it consciously rather than unconsciously. This points toward the integration that transpersonal psychology has attempted, holding together the psychological and the spiritual, the natural and the transcendent, the personal and the transpersonal. Such integration requires both the depth dimension Jung emphasized and the growth dimension Maslow celebrated. It requires taking the unconscious seriously while also cultivating conscious development. It requires honoring both the darkness we must integrate and the light we reach toward. The question of wholeness itself deserves deeper contemplation. Both men use this term, but with different connotations. Jung's wholeness meant the integration of all aspects of the personality, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, personal and collective. Wholeness was not perfection, but completeness, not being good, but being entire. It required making room for everything, including what consciousness found most difficult or unacceptable. Maslow's wholeness was more about fullness of functioning, about the realization of potentials, about living fully and authentically. Whole people were those who had actualized their capacities, who lived from being values, who experienced frequent connection with transcendent dimensions of life. Wholeness was health, optimal functioning, the flowering of human potential. These are different emphases, but perhaps not contradictory. True wholeness might require both the integration of shadow material and the actualization of potentials, both depth and height, both acceptance of what is and reaching toward what can be. The most whole human beings might be those who have done both the depth work of confronting shadow and the growth work of actualizing potential, who have both descended into darkness and ascended toward light. This suggests that the dialogue between Jung and Maslow is not a matter of choosing one or the other, but of recognizing that both are necessary for a complete understanding of human transformation. We need Jung's insights about the unconscious, about shadow, about the dangerous and difficult aspects of psychological work. We need Maslow's celebration of human potential, his emphasis on health and growth, his optimistic vision of what human beings can become. Neither alone is sufficient. Together they provide a more complete map. Consider what this means for how we live, how we approach our own development and that of others. If we emphasize only depth and shadow work, we can become mired in the unconscious, focused only on pathology and problems, missing the possibilities for growth and transcendence. If we emphasize only growth and actualization, we can become inflated, denying shadow, creating a false wholeness that excludes difficult aspects of ourselves. The path of genuine transformation requires both movements down into depth and up toward height, in into shadow and out toward potential, back into the unconscious and forward toward actualization. This is the spiral path, not a straight line, but a circling that revisits old issues at new levels, that integrates more deeply while reaching more fully toward possibility. This spiral movement mirrors the alchemical process Jung studied so carefully. The work begins with the prima materia, the raw material of the psyche as it is, with all its conflicts and contradictions. Through various operations, dissolution, separation, conjunction, this material is transformed. But the transformation is not linear. It requires repeated circulation through the same processes at deeper levels. The opus contra naturam, the work against nature, requires working with what is most difficult, most rejected, most unconscious. Only through this difficult work does the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, emerge that symbol of wholeness and transformation. Maslow's hierarchy can be seen as compatible with this alchemical process, though framed differently. The base of the hierarchy, the basic needs, corresponds to the prima materia, the given conditions of embodied existence. The movement up through the hierarchy corresponds to the refinement and transformation of the original material. Self-actualization and transcendence correspond to the achievement of the lapis, the realization of full potential. Yet Jung would remind us that this ascent is not possible without descent, that the higher stages of the hierarchy cannot be genuinely reached without confronting what the lower stages contain. You cannot simply bypass basic needs and survival issues to reach transcendence. You must integrate each level, must work with the actual material of your life, must confront the shadow that accumulates at each stage of development. The social implications of their dialogue also deserve contemplation. Both men were ultimately focused on individual transformation, but both recognized that transformed individuals transform society. Jung saw that collective problems, war, prejudice, ideological possession arose from unconscious processes operating in masses of individuals. The solution was not primarily social engineering, but individual consciousness. As individuals became more conscious, withdrew projections, integrated shadow related to the self, collective consciousness would gradually shift. Maslow similarly believed that self-actualizing individuals naturally contributed to collective well-being. Their clear perception, democratic character, resistance to enculturation, and identification with being values made them naturally positive social forces. A society of self-actualizing people would be a very different and better society than one of neurotic, need-driven individuals. Yet both men can be criticized for insufficient attention to collective and structural dimensions of human problems. Individual consciousness and self-actualization, while valuable, may not be sufficient to address collective issues like poverty, oppression, war, environmental destruction. These problems have structural dimensions that require collective action and social transformation, not just individual psychological work. A more complete approach would integrate individual and collective dimensions, recognizing that personal transformation and social transformation are mutually reinforcing. Individuals cannot fully develop in oppressive social conditions, and social structures cannot be transformed without transformed individuals. The dialogue between personal and collective, between inner work and outer action, is essential to addressing the full range of human problems. This points toward the limitations of any purely psychological approach to human transformation. Psychology can illuminate individual development but cannot replace ethics, politics, spirituality, or community. Human beings exist in multiple dimensions, individual and collective, psychological and social, material and spiritual. Any complete understanding of human transformation must address all these dimensions, recognizing both their distinctness and their interdependence. Yet within the psychological domain, Jung and Maslow made invaluable contributions. They expanded psychology's vision beyond pathology and mechanism to include meaning, transcendence, and the positive potentials of human nature. They showed that psychology could address questions of value, purpose, and ultimate concern without becoming mere philosophy or theology. They demonstrated that empirical investigation and depth of understanding were not contradictory but complementary. Their dialogue continues to be relevant precisely because the questions they addressed are perennial. How do we become more fully ourselves? What blocks development, and how can these blocks be addressed? What is the relationship between conscious and unconscious, between ego and self, between personal and transpersonal? How do we cultivate both individual well-being and collective flourishing? These questions do not have final answers. They must be lived and explored by each generation in its own context. Contemporary psychology has moved beyond both Jung and Maslow in many ways. Neuroscience provides insights into brain mechanisms that neither could have imagined. Research on development, cognition, emotion, and personality has grown exponentially. New therapeutic approaches have emerged. Yet the fundamental questions they raised remain, and their frameworks continue to provide resources for addressing these questions. The integration of their perspectives points toward what we might call an integral psychology, one that honors both depth and height, both conscious and unconscious, both shadow and potential, both descent and ascent. Such a psychology would draw on Jung's insights about the unconscious, archetypes, shadow, and symbolic processes, while also incorporating Maslow's emphasis on health, growth, and human potential. It would recognize that transformation requires both confronting what we have rejected and actualizing what we can become. This integral approach would also be developmental, recognizing that different stages of life call for different emphases. The first half of life may require more focus on ego development, on establishing oneself in the world, on meeting basic needs here. Maslow's hierarchy provides a helpful framework. The second half of life may require more focus on integration of unconscious material, on confronting shadow, on approaching the self. Here Jung's individuation process becomes more central. Yet both movements occur throughout life, in different proportions at different times. Such an approach would also be contextual, recognizing that different cultural contexts and historical moments call for different emphases. Post-war American optimism made Maslow's positive psychology appropriate and helpful. War-torn European experience made Jung's depth psychology necessary and profound. Contemporary challenges, environmental crisis, technological transformation, social fragmentation require drawing on both traditions while also moving beyond them. What might this integral approach look like in practice? It would begin where people are, attending to their actual needs and circumstances, not imposing a predetermined path. It would help them meet basic needs while also attending to deeper psychological patterns. It would support growth and actualization while also exploring shadow and unconscious material. It would honor peak experiences while also respecting the power of the numinous. It would cultivate individual development while maintaining awareness of collective context. Such an approach would also be humble, recognizing the limits of what psychology can achieve. Psychological work is essential but not sufficient. It must be complemented by ethical action, by spiritual practice, by engagement with community, by attending to the body and to material needs. The psyche does not exist in isolation but is embedded in body, relationships, culture, and world. Transformation must occur at all these levels if it is to be complete. As we contemplate the dialogue between Jung and Maslow from this integral perspective, we can appreciate how each illuminates aspects of the human journey that the other underemphasizes. Jung shows us the depths we must explore, the shadow we must integrate, the symbolic riches of the unconscious, the difficult but necessary work of making consciousness more complete. Maslow shows us the heights we can reach, the potentials we can actualize, the joy of peak experiences, the inspiration of studying people at their best. Together they remind us that being human is an extraordinary adventure, a journey that includes both descent into depths and ascent to heights, both confrontation with darkness and reaching toward light, both the difficult work of integration and the joy of actualization. They remind us that we are not finished products but processes in motion, not static entities but dynamic becomings, not merely what we appear to be but possibilities reaching toward realization. This recognition can be profoundly freeing. We need not be defined by our past, by our symptoms, by our limitations. Yet we also cannot ignore these realities or bypass them in favor of transcendent aspirations. We must work with what is, with the actual material of our lives, while also reaching toward what can be. This is the work of a lifetime, never complete, always unfolding, always revealing new depths and new possibilities. The journey toward wholeness that both men described is ultimately a mystery. We can map its stages, describe its phenomenology, provide frameworks for understanding it. But the actual movement of the soul toward wholeness remains something that cannot be fully captured in concepts or theories. It must be lived, experienced, undergone. Each person's path is unique, though it follows patterns that are universal. Each person's wholeness looks different, though it participates in a common humanity. This mystery is what keeps both Jung's and Maslow's work alive and relevant. They did not claim to have final answers, but offered maps and frameworks for the journey. They pointed toward possibilities and provided languages for experiences that might otherwise remain inchoate. They legitimized the inner journey at a time when psychology was largely focused on observable behavior or reducing psyche to biology. They insisted that consciousness, meaning, and transcendence were worthy of serious study and attention. Their dialogue across time and tradition reminds us that psychology at its best is not a narrow technical discipline, but a form of wisdom, a way of understanding the human condition in its depth and breadth. It requires both scientific rigor and philosophical depth, both empirical observation and intuitive understanding, both analytical precision and poetic sensibility. Jung and Maslow embodied different aspects of this comprehensive approach, each contributing unique gifts while leaving space for what they did not address. As this long night of exploration draws toward its close, as these ideas begin to blur into the dream world that awaits, let yourself rest in the recognition that the journey toward wholeness is yours to make in your own way. You need not choose between Jung and Maslow, between depth and height, between shadow work and actualization. The path that calls to you may emphasize one more than the other at different times, may draw on different resources as your needs and questions change. What matters is that you remain engaged with the journey, that you attend to both the depths and the heights, that you honor both the darkness you must integrate and the light you reach toward. The conversation between these great minds continues, not just in books and theories, but in the actual lives of people who do this work, who confront their shadows and actualize their potentials, who descend into unconscious depths and ascend toward conscious heights, who make themselves whole by integrating what they have been and reaching toward what they can become. This conversation is alive in you, in your own journey of transformation, in the unique way your soul is making itself known through the experiences of your life. May the insights of both Jung and Maslow serve you in your own unfolding. May you have courage for the descent into shadow and confidence for the ascent toward potential. May you encounter both the numinous depths Jung explored and the peak experiences Maslow celebrated. May you become more fully yourself, while also transcending the limited self you have been. And may the dialogue between depth and height, between integration and actualization, between Jung and Maslow, continue to illuminate the path toward the wholeness that is your birthright and your journey. Rest now in the knowledge that the work of becoming human continues through sleep and dream, through darkness and light, through all the many moments of your one precious life. The conversation between these two great souls has been our companion tonight, and their wisdom will continue to work in you as you sleep, as you dream, as you wake to another day of the endless journey toward wholeness. Sleep well, wanderer of the psyche's many landscapes. The path continues tomorrow, and you will be different for having listened to this dialogue between depth and height, between shadow and light, between Carl Jung and Abraham Maslow, two seekers of the soul whose conversation never ends but keeps opening new possibilities, for understanding what it means to be fully, wholly, magnificently human.